Hello Internet, and welcome to another episode of Experimental Cataclysm, the show where we talk about recent changes to the experimental version of Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead. There are quite a lot of changes that I want to talk about this week. I may end up trimming some of the small ones from the final edit, but yeah, there's a lot. So I'm going to try to be quick, at least about the small stuff, and we'll go from there. Also, up front, let's address the elephant in the room. Yes, my Discord account was compromised. Thank you to everyone who had contacted me about it, because I found out pretty much immediately I was able to recover the account very quickly. In fact, it was only out of my control for a few hours. Apologies to anyone who got spam from me, and yeah, I did a round of password changes. I set up two-factor. I did all the stuff that you are supposed to do that I should have done a long time ago, and hopefully we won't have that issue again. Alright, on to the changes. First up today, we've got an expansion of flag variants. This is actually a very small change that has basically no impact on the game whatsoever. We got one PR that added pride flags to the game, and another PR that added the state flags for the various New England states. Now, I mentioned this up front for two reasons because of these pride flags. Number one, I know that some of you are going to be very mad about this, and I frankly want you to be mad about it, you sad little people. And then number two, I also know that some of you will be pretty happy to see this, and I want you to be happy. There's really not much to say about this. The pride flags were added by Frizz, and then Bark added the New England flags. The only thing I wanted to note here is that the pride flags actually have their own base items, so this is not going to interfere. We have a quest in the game that asks you to fetch a United States flag, and this is not going to interfere with that. That was the only thing I could think of when I saw this that would have any actual impact on gameplay, and it's a non-issue. Next up from A Nickel N, we've got some rebalances to weapon to hit values. We talked about this in the last show. Same person, same thing, basically them going through and making sure that the to hit values on weapons were what they were supposed to be. They have submitted 2 additional PRs, or maybe more. These are just the 2 that I saw. These focus on kitchen knives and spears/pole arms, and that means that yes, you may well notice that the to hit value on your spear has changed. You may need to reassess your favorite weapon and see if it is still worth using. If you want more information, you can check out the PR or check the last video. We did talk a little bit more in depth about why these rebalances happen. Next up today from Mail Clips, we've got acid ants. Older players will know that we used to have acid ants as well as acid ant hills, which are basically just ant hills, but they have acid ants. Now apparently at some point these ant hills and whatnot were removed, although I didn't even realize that they had been removed. Mail Clips has now made it that they will begin spawning once again. Now I personally really hate the ants in this game. We talk about this every time that we talk about mutated insects or animals, but I don't like that they're all very advanced at the very start of the game. The base level acid ants are 40 kilos, which is obviously just, a smidge bigger than your real life ant, and this implies that they've been mutating for quite a while. And the fact that they also have a large network of tunnels and that they tend to completely dominate nearby map gen shows that they are proliferating rapidly. I personally don't think that this makes a whole lot of sense, and I also think that anthills basically just make surrounding areas unusable. The acid ants specifically are also pretty insane because of their acid attacks. It does have a long cooldown, but there's also a lot of ants, and they're all going to use their acid attack on you as soon as they're able. So I consider these creatures and their anthills to be pretty broken in terms of game balance, and I really don't like them. Now none of that is Mail Clips' fault, by the way. These are my opinions on ants that I've had for years and years. It has nothing to do with this PR. But anyway, I was supposed to keep this short. Acid anthills and the like now exist again. I think they should be completely reworked into smaller creatures and made so that they don't spawn like 1200 ants all around the nearby map, but whatever, I don't know. I get that we have enemies that lock the player out of certain areas because they would just be too tedious or powerful to deal with. I just don't personally find that to be very fun. Next up today from Lyle SY, we've got the addition of a seafood restaurant. Typically our restaurants all look pretty much the same as they are. There are a few themed versions, but most of them seem very standard, have roughly the same meals and ingredients in the kitchen, etc, etc. But anyway, the point is there's not a whole lot of variety to the restaurants in the game. But now Lyle has added a seafood restaurant, and since I like restaurants, I looked into it just a little bit. In the kitchen you can find things specific to that sort of restaurant, like lobster meat and lobster rolls. However, it looks like there are a bunch of things spawning that are also just like regular restaurant foods. For example, in my testing I found a bunch of macaroni, a lot of Italian seasoning, curry powder, things like that I don't traditionally associate with seafood. But then I guess I really don't know. Maybe they serve pasta and whatnot as at a seafood restaurant. I personally hate seafood, by the way. Everything in the ocean is pretty disgusting. So, but anyway, yeah, new seafood restaurant. Let's just move along. Next up today from Bombastic Slacks, we've got nested crafting recipes. In a nutshell, this PR makes it so that recipes in the crafting menu can now be nested. So for example, after our recent steel reworks, we now have many types of plate mail that are all listed in the crafting menu. Now instead of listing each of them individually, we could just have one thing that says plate mail, and then when you select that, the game would then move you to a new tab in the menu called nested, and it would display all of those plate mail recipes. So if you were just browsing recipes, you wouldn't have to see these 30 plate mail recipes unless you selected plate mail first, and then the game would show you all of the possible recipes. Now when I first saw this, I thought it was pretty clunky. Moving to a different tab just to see the nested recipes seems very annoying. Well, and to be honest, it kind of is annoying. There's no way to back out to where you were before, so you have to actually tab back to wherever you were looking before the game took you to the nested tab. In a perfect world, these would be nested where they already exist, and selecting them would just open the recipes in the tab that you're already on. However, that aside, this is going to be a pretty nice quality of life thing. I see people complain about what they refer to as recipe bloat all the time. I just got a comment on YouTube about that the other day. And I think referring to this as bloat is a little unfair, by the way. The vast majority of our recipes do different things. They are not redundant. But I also do understand that the crafting menu is jam-packed with recipes, even more so now that we have things like multiple steel armor recipes. Now another unfortunate aspect of this mostly positive change is that every recipe will need to be categorized in order to use this new system. We have already seen a few PRs from A Nickel N making multiple recipes nested. For example, they made it so that cuirasses are organized in this way. So you would select cuirass from the crafting menu, and then there are subcategories for the different materials. Then when you select a type, let's say bronze cuirasses, then it will display all of the appropriate recipes. Even for items that do not have multiple materials, most of them have small or large variants for mutants, which then can also be nested. So overall, this could cut down a lot of recipes in the crafting menu. The catch is just that people will need to organize hundreds and hundreds of recipes to use the new system. And the only issue that I saw was the inability to back up, like I said. So let's say I was looking at these cuirasses and I selected bronze. Well, maybe I want to go back and compare that to a scrap cuirass. I don't have the option to back up. I actually have to go back to the armor tab, open cuirasses again, and then check the scrap cuirass. This is really the only problem I see. Also, I said cuirass like 100 times in this section, and yes, as far as I know, that's how it's pronounced. Don't bother me about it. If that's not how it's pronounced, then I probably sound pretty stupid. But let's just move along. Next up from Irwis, we've got a simple UI change surrounding proficiencies that you obtain through dissection. If you didn't know, when you dissect creatures, you can potentially gain proficiencies. Mostly you would want these because of the weak point system. Having some of them will allow you to exploit the weak points of certain creatures. Anyway, there really wasn't a way to know what proficiencies you would actually gain from dissecting a specific creature. Now, thanks to this PR, you will see a list of proficiencies that you could potentially learn while you dissect that specific creature. You can see this in the butchery menu. When you move your indicator over dissection, you will see a blurb of text as you always have, but at the bottom you will see a list of proficiencies. It also gives information about them, showing if you already have the proficiency or if you are missing a prerequisite, things like that. This is a very simple change overall, but definitely a nice little quality of life improvement. It should cut down on the number of people asking about weak point proficiencies and some of the confusion that people have around it. Next up today, we've got a pair of PRs from Vanera addressing monster triggers. I'm not going to cover everything because mostly you probably would not care, but I do want to talk about one thing specifically. In the last episode, we talked about cows, and I mentioned that once a creature was hostile, it would remain hostile forever. It looks like either that was not true, or at least it is no longer the case. Given enough time, an animal that became hostile should back off and stop being hostile. Second, I mentioned how the Exodii quadrupeds were causing players trouble because they would become aggressive after being attacked by other creatures. This should no longer be the case. There is now some amount of logic behind what made the creature angry. So if a zombie walks up and smacks a quadruped, the zombie will get obliterated, but the Exodii won't start attacking you as the player. I really can't stress how great this is. This has been a problem in the game for a really long time. The only slight caveat here is that NPCs are tracked the same way as the player. So to my understanding, if an NPC were to, for some reason, slap a quadruped, they would then become hostile to you as the player. Still though, this is a really great PR. I'm very happy to see this, especially with the whole quadruped thing. There were a lot of players upset that they became locked out of interacting with Rubik because the whole building was succeeding in killing them when they got close. And this happened even though they had done nothing wrong. Actually, to pop in here as the editor and completely undermine everything I just said, there are still issues with the Exodii quadrupeds. Now, as I was gathering footage for this video and testing this feature, I discovered that quadrupeds, when they accidentally hit each other, they will still target the player afterwards. I did make an issue about this on the GitHub. Vanira chimed in and implied that I think when a quadruped attacks another quadruped, they are using the spell system. And the spell system for attacks apparently routes that damage through a fictional NPC. So basically, when a quadruped attacks another quadruped, it's being considered an NPC attacking that quadruped, which then, again, NPCs are factored the same as the player, so they still attack the player. This is obviously a huge issue. Hopefully, it has some sort of resolution. Most monsters in the game that use the spell system to attack are already hostile to the player, so it wouldn't be an issue for most of them, but obviously the main issue here is the Exodii quadrupeds. We really need a way for them to remain neutral to the player even when they've been attacked. Because they're treated as monsters, this is leading to most people not being able to go in and talk to Rubik if there were zombies nearby and these enemies get triggered. But anyway, sorry for the addendum here, let's just get back to the video. Next up today from, I'm gonna say P. Shep Jr. I don't know if that's what this is. But anyway, we've got a new location and a new scenario. The location is a retirement community and the scenario starts you in that location. It's called Golden Years. This is a proper retirement community. I actually live pretty close to one of these places. It's not a nursing home per se, as in it's not a small facility for people who are mostly like terminal end of life care. It's actually a proper community with houses and facilities. Now, without spoiling it too much, there are the expected things, there's residential areas for the blue hairs, there's parks, things like that, but there are other facilities as well, like a pool, a gym, etc., etc. This location is pretty unique. We really don't have anything else like this. It's also worth pointing out that I don't recognize the person who submitted this and that this is actually a pretty enormous bit of map gen. And they used nested chunks, so for someone I don't know to show up and dive into map gen with both feet, leading to such a large location being added to the game, well, that's kind of noteworthy in and of itself. But anyway, when we get stuff like this, I try not to overshare details too much because it's pretty rare that we get a new scenario and whatnot. I don't really want to spoil things. Obviously, this is a new place you might want to check out on your own. Also, I haven't personally played the scenario yet, right? It was added literally like 2 days ago as I'm saying this. I assume that there's food and probably medications, standard stuff like that. So yeah, go check out this new scenario called Golden Years and explore this new location. Next up today from Bombastic Slacks, we've got some changes to vitamins. Most of the work done in this PR is behind the scenes stuff. There's really only one major player facing change, and that was to make things a little bit easier for you to be able to track your health and just your vitamin intake as the player. So for example, when you open the consume menu at the top, there is relevant information about your character, their hunger, their thirst, etc., etc. It now displays your vitamin intake for that particular day. By default, if you have no ability to track this, it will just display a rough estimate of the vitamins you've consumed. You'll see words like a little or plenty rather than exact values. However, if you have an item that allows you to track this information, it will show you much more precise information showing a percentage display. Now, if you didn't know, we actually have a fitness band in the game that lets you track your calorie intake. Smartphones also have this ability. The fitness band does require you to wear the item to get access to that information, but having a smartphone in your inventory will work. So as long as you have one of those two items, you will be able to see a more precise bit of detail regarding vitamin intake. It will be displayed as a percentage rather than that vague guess of just a few words. Now, since we now gain health based on our daily intake of vitamins, this will be extremely helpful. This PR also added a new line in your character menu. If you look at the panel in the top left where your stats and personal information are displayed, you will see a new entry called Lifestyle. Again, this is a vague indicator, it's not exact, but it gives you an idea about your character's health, displaying things like you feel fine or feel very bad, things like that. Now, there's no way to make this more precise. The tracker doesn't help here, and that's because in real life you generally don't have like really precise information about your health. Really, all that you would get is just a vague notion of how you're feeling. Oh, today I feel sick, or today I feel fine, things like that. Now, this again is pretty noteworthy as well because we've never had anything like this in the game before. For years, the only way to know how your health was doing was to either cheat with the debug menu, have the the self-aware trait, or wait until you wake up and get a health message printed in a log. Now those messages still do exist, but this new feature allows you to check how you're doing at any given time. Overall, this is a pretty handy change that will allow people to better understand their health and their vitamin intake. I did see someone complain about how this does not display information for toxins, but I think that's a pretty bad take. Toxins from mutant meat are treated as vitamins in terms of the game code, but they are not actually vitamins. Your character would have no idea what a normal amount of, it's basically poison, so we don't know how much we should be taking. And honestly, most characters probably don't even know that this meat is toxic until they become sick later on. To them, it's just funky meat. I doubt any of your characters are putting this under a microscope to understand that there are toxins. So yeah, I think this is a nice change. This also further incentivizes players to seek out and carry one of those trackers that I mentioned. And hopefully this will help people to better understand health, since they'll be able to see a basic summary in the character menu whenever they want to check it. Next up today from Maricona, we've got the addition of cremation and urns. Now the idea being that one of your NPCs or a pet passes away and you want to preserve their legacy in some capacity. We've had coffins and graves in the game for a while, but I often see people posting about how they can't actually bury the sealed coffin. It is a bit finicky, and it's not really intuitive when you do it the first time, since it requires both crafting and the construction menu and blah blah etc. But now, thanks to this PR, we've got the option to use cremation. It's pretty simple as far as things go. When you burn a body, it will produce corpse ash rather than the ash that you would, normally get from burning logs or whatever. This corpse ash, of course, represents the remains of your fallen companion. You can put these wherever you want, but several urns were also added to the game specifically for holding ashes. There were 3 urns that were added. Some of them can be found in houses and mansions. I don't know if they spawn with ashes in them, they probably do. But also the player can craft clay urns if they want to go that route. Now I really like this PR. I typically don't play with NPCs or pets, not really, but if I did, I would probably want to bury them or something like that when they passed away. Cremation is a lot more intuitive than the in-game coffin and grave system. It's also easier. There's no need to build a coffin. You can just toss your companion into the fire and scoop up their ashes several hours later. So yeah, this is in the game now. Make sure you give your companions a proper send-off when they pass away. And then finally today from Irk, we've got some changes to monster evolution. Now I won't bore you with the actual details of the implementation, but basically the game has been changing for several years and monster evolution was not really keeping up with the new changes. Okay, so basically several years ago, let's say back in like 0.C, enemies would evolve, but they also started out very powerful. Essentially, you could walk out of the evac shelter on day 1 and find a big group of highly dangerous late game enemies. Now this mostly it sucked. I didn't enjoy that at all. Enemy progression didn't really exist, but neither did player progression. It was very easy for you to become powerful in just a few days. There were not as many items in the game as there are now. Crafts were not balanced for realism and took, almost no time. And because of these things, there was a very clear and straightforward progression that allowed a player's power to ramp out of control pretty quickly. Then a few years ago, things kind of started changing. Ultra powerful enemies stopped spawning on day 1. We got more of a progression to enemy difficulty as you played the game. Players also started being less powerful. A lot of the like melee and unarmed that was previously really overpowered, that stuff got nerfed to be more reasonable. Proficiencies got added, crafting times were increased, skill gain changed, a lot of things slowed down player progression. But anyway, that's probably too long-winded. Point is that nowadays your character crafts a lot slower. We gain proficiencies pretty slowly, and it takes a lot of work and materials to get powerful weapons and armor. Not to mention the fact that making a proper deathmobile now is significantly slower and harder than it was several years ago. This has led to the point where if you decide like, hey, I'm going to take a couple in-game weeks to raise my character's ability, well, when you emerge, the monster evolution has kept on ticking up. By the time you're done raising your skills, enemies outside might be entirely too powerful for your stage of the game. Now, I know a lot of you might not regard this as a problem. I see a lot of people complaining, wanting the game to be artificially more difficult. Most of the time, these suggestions that people make about difficulty are bad suggestions. They usually are poorly balanced and they don't really fit with the development direction. There is an art to balancing a game, and we need to find a way to reconcile monster evolution with our expanded crafting times and proficiency requirements. But anyway, that was probably too long of an explanation. ERC has made an effort to rebalance monster evolution to better fit with our current game progression pacing. This was a huge bit of auditing, and frankly, I will not know how much it affects the game until we've all played with it for several weeks or even months. The general idea is just to flat out across the board slow down monster evolution. But again, in practice, this will require a lot of playtesting to see if the balance is right. So I think overall this is a good change, but we won't fully know if it's well executed until we've taken some time to experience it. Please don't knee-jerk hate this change. People did that when monster spawns and whatnot were scaled back several years ago. I know that we have a lot of members of our community that like to be very vocal and hate on basically anything that involves game balance. These sort of changes are necessary to keep the game running smoothly, and as I said, the game, balancing a game is pretty difficult. But yeah, you're gonna do whatever. I'm just here to talk about changes. And with that, I think we are ready to wrap the show. If this thing made it out on Friday, it's nothing short of a miracle. It's been a long week for me. I might end up cutting a lot of the small stuff and try to rein this into like a 15-minute episode, but we'll see how it turns out. But anyway, thank you for watching. Hopefully you found this helpful, and I of course will be back in a couple of weeks with another episode. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you next time.